All right, welcome to your final two sets of notes. I'm only doing one today, though, but between today and tomorrow, we are going to start the Civil War. So these are going to be pretty short. I wouldn't expect these to take any more than 12 minutes or so, but do take the time to look at the videos. I definitely want you to look at the videos kind of as a reference of some of the things that we're talking about. Today, I'll introduce probably a John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry. It's pretty cool. It's a very interesting one to learn about and to talk about too. So I'll drop a video on you for that. So you've got your last 20 points or so come in by form of your sets of notes, and then you're going to have your test on Friday. So note today, note tomorrow. Wednesday will be review. I'll do a little review video for you. And then Thursday, I'm going to give you the day off, except to study. Take some time to study. And then Friday, you're going to take the test. Do not be late taking the test. Take it Friday. Got all day. I don't want you to turn it in the following Monday or Tuesday because it's not fair for everybody else to have the same time to study and then you get extra time because you didn't take it on time. So therefore, if you take it late, you're going to lose points. Just get it done. So also being said, make sure you get caught up on things if you need to get caught up on things because there's a few of you who are close to failing or are failing, and you can change that around if you're going to actually work on stuff to get it turned in. So anyways, make your stuff count today. Pay attention to the video. Watch the video. Don't scroll ahead because I know some of you are because I can tell how many people are actually watching the videos. And so if you stink it up on the test, it's not my fault if you're not actually listening to me explaining what we're doing here. So we are starting from where we last left off. This is still on reform. And the last set of notes we talked about tensions over slavery, popular sovereignty. Remember, that's the rights of states to make decisions on their own, especially when it comes to slavery and other issues. Compromise of 1850, which allowed for California to come in free, but at the same time, other states from the Mexican-American territory could vote on slavery as they needed. And it also introduced the Fugitive Slave Act, which is now a governmental rule that you had to help slave catchers and owners if they come into northern states to take the slaves away. We had Uncle Tom's Cabin, which Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote about, telling you about the horrors and the ills of slavery. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where Kansas and Nebraska were given the rights to vote on their sovereignty, or actually sovereignty, to vote on slavery or not. And so a lot of people came in, especially a guy named John Brown, who we'll talk about again today, and ended up fighting, and some people died. So Bleeding Kansas is the name of that. So it leads to more violence today. As it says up top, Senate attack. It's hard when you have violence on one side to not have violence on the other side too. You can kind of see this here with the political cartoon that you have slavery being crammed down the throat, as it says here, of a free soiler by the Democratic Party, which, by the way, the Democratic Party is what the Republican Party actually is today. So it actually flip-flopped from what it was back in the time period. And it actually is true. So if you want to look it up, don't believe me, well, you can look it up. It actually is accurate. So this violence just keeps getting worse. And so you have this guy named Charles Sumner, who is an abolitionist. I'm not sure why that cut off. But Charles Sumner was a Massachusetts abolitionist who denounced slavery. He was a staunch abolitionist. He was really against slavery. And while he is in Senate, he verbally attacked Senator Andrew Butler from South Carolina. Now, he didn't physically attack him. It was a verbal attack about slavery and the horrors of slavery and how terrible it is, and perhaps I would have attacked him on his haircut. I'm not sure what's going on right there either. But word gets back to his nephew, Butler's nephew, who is named Preston Brooks. And Brooks comes into the Senate chambers later on and ends up beating Charles Sumner nearly to death in the Senate building, in the Capitol building. In the halls of the Senate, as you can see from these pictures, beats him with a cane. So imagine that in the halls of our legislative branch, they now have this violence going on. And so you can clearly see the United States is having issues, and people are taking sides. And so now you start to have violence, which begets violence back and forth, even in our hallowed halls of the legislative branch. Uh, so now at this point, the U.S. is officially split. Now, I'm not talking about physically and talking about borders or anything like that. That's going to come in the next set of notes. But instead, ideologically or philosophically, that you really are on one side or on the other. There's really no in between or any gray areas, they'll call it, for this. So the U.S. is now officially split. So you're either for slavery or you're against slavery. That's really how it is. And speaking more on Preston Brooks, so many people in the South were supportive of what he did and his physical beatdown, that they sent him more canes in the hope that he would take more canes and beat up more abolitionists. So, not the best thing in the world, I don't think. And then that leads us to Dred Scott. Now, Dred Scott, African-American male, his story is significant because in March 1857, this was a Supreme Court decision. So the story for Dred Scott, now make sure you can follow along with this. Now, Dred Scott was a former slave who sued for his freedom because he lived where slavery was illegal. So here's the story behind Dred Scott. He was owned by a doctor, and the doctor moved around from state to state and state to state. And as wherever he went, Dred Scott went. Well, he ended up moving to a state where slavery was not legal. And so Dred Scott was still with him. And then the doctor ended up moving to another state where slavery was legal. So Dred Scott says, and I think this is correct, he says, when I lived in that slave state, I should not have been a slave. I should have my freedom, because when I went with this doctor to this state where slavery was illegal, then I should have been free. And then even though we moved to another state where slavery is legal, I should still be free because I was free in a state originally. I shouldn't go from slavery to freedom and back to slavery again. So it becomes a Supreme Court decision. It goes to the all the way to Washington, D.C. It goes to our most hallowed part of the judicial branch. And here's what they decide. The Supreme Court's reply was slaves were property and had no right to sue. So even though he was in a state where slavery was illegal, it doesn't matter. The Supreme Court saw him as a slave, sees him as property, not as a citizen, not as a human being, and therefore you have no right to sue. So, it's comparable to your cow suing you, which wouldn't work so well, because all they would say is moo, I suppose. But on the serious side here, this really is a shutdown for abolitionists, for African Americans, because now they're not, they can't sue. They don't have any basic rights whatsoever in our judicial system. And the Supreme Court slams down the Missouri Compromise as being unconstitutional. Now, if you don't remember what the Missouri Compromise was, go all the way back. The Missouri Compromise had Maine and Missouri coming in as slave state and free state, kept the balance, and basically said that you don't have to have that balance anymore. It's not needed, it's not necessary. So if more slave states want to come in, then they can do so. So again, slap in the face to your abolitionists and your northerners. So in other words, what this meant for the South is that all territories could have slaves. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where they came from, doesn't matter what it said, it's unconstitutional, popular sovereignty rules. So all states, all territories that are coming in could have slaves. On the flip side, the North is stunned, because at this point in 1857, they'd hoped slavery would die out. Unfortunately, it would not. So again, another giant wedge that gets put into in between abolitionists and pro-slavery people that, well, it's going to end up leading us to the Civil War. And so the very last thing I want to talk about today is John Brown's raid. Now, before we talk about John Brown's raid, for those of you who've made it this far in the set of notes, good job. I have a feeling that people aren't doing that and paying attention to the video. So when you get to your set of notes where it says content statement, underneath the content statement, I want you to put one word. I want you to put Bengal. Bengal, Bengal. Because if you put that word in there, I know that you made it this far and you're actually doing what you're supposed to. So those who don't do that are going to lose some points because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So again, content statement, just put the word Bengal. There you go. There's your secret word for your set of notes. Now, back to the finish of the notes. So here we have John Brown. Remember, we just talked about John Brown. Bleeding Kansas, staunch abolitionist. God told him many things, including to go to Bleeding Kansas or go to Kansas and fight for the abolitionist movement to get rid of the horrors of slavery and everything else. Now, look at him now. He's not the young man that he was before. He's looking more like Moses from the Bible. Got a big beard going. Kind of jealous of that one. So his raid takes place in 1859. So it's after all these Supreme Court decisions in a place called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Harper's Ferry is a sleepy little town right beside the river. I think real hard what river that is. But anyways, by the river, Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And why this little place is important is because they had an arsenal. Now, an arsenal is where the Army keeps their weapons. Kind of keeps it separate from everybody, the gunpowder, the ammunition, everything. So you have it away from people and under lock and key, I suppose. So John Brown knows this. So he's been given a vision by God that he should raise up a slave army and he should seize guns from the U.S. Army. So that's what he plans to do. That God told John Brown that not only would he be successful, but that slaves would join him and help form an army. Now, Brown didn't think that slaves would be able to fire the guns, so he had some big pikes made ahead of time. If you're not familiar with a pike is a sharp, pointy stick. So in this case, he had some sharp, pointy sticks ready, and he had a group of men that I think was around 12 strong, 10 to 12, including several of his sons and a couple of former slaves, including one who's named Dangerfield Newby. We'll talk about him in a second. So Brown and his men take this arsenal at night. Nobody's expecting anything because it's in a southern state. And how would anybody dare to cross in the southern state and take an arsenal? Well, John Brown did. And they were actually successful. They took the arsenal unexpectedly, pretty much without firing a shot. But word gets out to the townspeople that a northerner has come in and has taken this arsenal. Now, Brown thought that word would get out, but he thought on the other side of things that it would get to the slaves, and then the slaves would come and support him, and that they could raise up an army with all of those weapons and be able to run roughshod all through the South. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. No supporters really came for John Brown. Instead, the village people came. And the village people came and took out a couple of his men, fired upon the arsenal, and killing Dangerfield Newby right away. And then one of the gruesome parts of the story is they ended up throwing him to some hogs. I believe they cut off his ears and threw him to some hogs, so it tells you what they thought about that. And so John Brown and the remaining men, including his son, are inside this arsenal. And then in comes the U.S. Army. Now, remember, it's a southern state, but we're still the Union. So the U.S., the federal army, come in, led by some guy named Robert E. Lee. Now, this ends up being important because Robert E. Lee will later become the general of the South. Not the leader, not the president, but he will be the head of the army for the Southern Army, for the Confederacy. But at the time, he is, I believe he's a major in the U.S. Army. So Lee ends up, with his men, end up taking the arsenal, firing on John Brown and other people. Brown survives. A man runs towards him with a bayonet on his rifle, goes to stab John Brown through. Brown is saved by his belt buckle. According to the story, the bayonet hits the belt buckle and bends the bayonet, and so Brown doesn't die. However, he is wounded. Not sure if it was mortally, but it was serious injury. I believe one of his sons died as well. But Brown ends up being put on trial for treason. Treason, remember, that means to go against your own country. So at this court trial, that's the word I'm looking for. My goodness, Sunday, brain's fried. He goes to trial, And there he gives this impassioned speech about the horrors of slavery and why he went against, wanted to get these weapons and to form this army. Very passionate speech. However, it kind of fell on deaf ears because he was found guilty. He ends up being sentenced to death December 2nd, 1859. So a gallows is formed in Harper's Ferry right there. You see John Brown in the middle, and several of his men are executed as well. And look at all the troops that are down below. Kind of like toy soldiers there. But the reason is the army came because they thought that a lot of supporters for John Brown would come and help him out. Well, that didn't happen. However, he does die, and he's praised as a martyr in the North. Here they see him as a hero. A martyr is someone who dies for a cause, very similar to Joan of Arc would be for the French army last year. So the Northerners see him as a martyr. There's a famous song called John Brown's Body that is sung, and poems are wrote on his behalf, and we know that this is really the last straw. The Southerners on the other side thought he was a traitor. You know, how dare a Northerner come down, try to force an abolitionist movement on them and take away their guns, slavery, and said, how dare this guy do that? So that split becomes further and further. Now, we're not quite there yet, but we're getting close. We still have a presidential election that's coming due. But at this point, the South is pretty much convinced the North would destroy their way of life. And that's it. They really thought that. So we now have a split, and what's left is the election of 1860, which is a big deal because this is Abraham Lincoln coming in to the White House, spoiler alert, and we'll see what kind of reactions the Southerners would have for him. But the obvious thing is, spoiler alert again, the Civil War will start tomorrow. So there's your set of notes. Make sure you do your secret word in the content statement so I know that you actually watched this. One more set of notes powered through, and then we'll take a test on Friday. I'll catch you later.